Welcome everyone to discover the Zen of writing with AsciiDoc. So I'm excited because I have a lot of stuff to show you today and a lot of different stuff. So I think it'll be exciting for you. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to help you discover the Zen of writing the Zen of writing by introducing you to a muse named AsciiDoc. And so this is what Scott Chacun, who's the author of ProGit, says is living the future of technical documentation. So we're really seeing a change here that's been occurring, and we have a lot of testimonials, a lot of people that have been using this in the field. So this comes from a very pragmatic standpoint, as well as the theory that you would expect to get from someone who's the lead of the project. So I am the lead of the AsciiDoc project. I'll tell you about this project in a little bit, but essentially it's I'm an author. I'm an author of a book. I'm an author of many technical manuals and tutorials online. And so, I know firsthand what it feels like to be an author, to have the pains of the authors, and I'm trying to solve the types of problems that I have personally and have solutions for all of you. So I want you to stop and just, reflect for a minute and think about what comes to mind when you think about writing in general or writing documentation. I think that perhaps you may identify with this poor fellow. We're going to call him Jacques. I don't know why, he just seems like a Jacques. You feel a bit stuck, overwhelmed, maybe a little bit anxious, depressed. These are not good feelings that we get when we think of writing. So why is this? Let's just think for a minute. Let's think about communication in general, because in order to solve this problem, we need to really step back and think about how we're getting to the point where we're so stressed about this. So think back to the beginning of this week and then throughout this week, and think about how much that you've communicated with people. You have to sort of realize that communication, if communication in general is like this, we may never leave the house. I mean, the fact it's quite the opposite. I mean, we really live to communicate. Really, life is less interesting when we're by ourselves. Okay, perhaps we need some time by ourselves, but eventually we get bored, and then we go out to interact. So communication is not difficult for us. As a matter of fact, what happens is you will walk up to someone, and really it's almost instantaneous that you know what it is that you want to say. You are being compelled sort of by some social norms and perhaps some many years of experience, but right away you think of something. Hey, I want to tell you this thing, and usually you feel pretty excited about it. When you're talking, you're not looking like Jacques, who's like, well, I don't know. Yesterday, I went to this talk, and it's more along the lines, you're not going to believe what I heard. It was amazing. I can't wait to use this stuff. So we're really excited. So again, we're thinking about this idea of, okay, so is it speaking? Speaking is easy. Maybe speaking is just natural for us. We've been doing this for tens of thousands of years. Maybe that's easy, but writing is hard. But while you're talking to someone, you might, oh, hold on, and let me just blast out a little text here. So not only are you writing, but you're writing while you're also holding a conversation in speech. So it's not necessarily that it's writing that's hard. Sometimes we might think that, writing is magic, but it does come quite naturally to us. And one of the reasons that this is easy is because it's conversational. So we're getting prompted. We're often asked a question, and we're really just answering the question. And we get a little text field at the bottom of our phone or on our screen, and it's a blank spot, and we fill it in. Okay? And it's just like filling in a form. You look at a form, you just know. You start writing your name. You don't even think, why am I filling out this form and do I actually have to do it? You sort of, you're almost compelled through habit just to start filling out a form if you see one. Probably one of the most subtle but important forms that we have these days is the Twitter field or Instagram or whatever. It's a blank spot. And it asks, notice that it's not just a blank field. Notice what is above it. And that's really the important thing here. It says, what's happening? So when you see the field, almost subconsciously, you're already trying to fill it in. And using that same force that when someone walks up to you, they say, how's it going? And you say, it's going well, or hopefully it's going well. So we're starting with questions. So this is important because this is going to come in a bit later when you think about why it is that we have difficulty with writing. So now we think back to the writing and we say, instead of knowing what to write, we feel this big question mark. I'm not quite sure. So there is a bit of a difference in technical documentation, and perhaps just in writing in general, that's absent from all those other forms that we've been talking about. Can anyone sort of identify at the very high level what that is? What's so different about when we write something formal versus when we were just talking with someone, texting or sending a tweet? It has to be, so that's important. There has to be correct. To whom are you writing? Yeah, you have to think about, well, maybe it's an end user, maybe it's a customer, etc. So you have to think about the audience. When you're writing a text message, that's very clear. It's the person that is looking at you. That's your audience. You don't have to do any analysis there. It's just that person. But there's one other really important thing. Think about a document, and what structure do you think of when you think of a document that perhaps is a technical document or a book? But I mean the structure of the content. And what does it start with? What's at the very beginning? Exactly. So the reason is that it has to be structured. There has to be a beginning and a middle and an end, and you have to be going somewhere. When someone asks you how's it going, you don't say, okay, just a second, here's what I'm going to be saying. First I'm going to talk about my morning, then I'm going to talk about my afternoon, and then I'm going to talk about what happened yesterday. Okay, going back to my morning, right? That's just not the way we converse. So fundamentally when we write, we can't use those instincts, or at least we think we can't use them. And actually something very, very powerful in this, which I'll address in a second. But suffice to say that, we really have to stop and we have to think about all these different constraints. And so one of my friends, who's also an author, we were exchanging emails, and someone had asked, what is it like to write a book, and should I do it? And he started out with a bit of a rant, and he finally got to the end. He's like, in summary, writing is an ordeal, okay? It just takes a long time, and it seems to cause a lot of pain. So we really want to ask the question as to why is it that we have so much difficulty transitioning into this, and is there anything that we can do as techniques so that we can make it easier, just like it is with speaking? So it's important that I put this particular example up. It's important that the title is what it is. So I was recently doing a writing project. We were writing about what the build tool Gradle is. But notice how it starts with a question. Why Gradle? So now I know why I'm writing. It's like, what's happening? Why would you care about Gradle? Okay, so I know reasons why you should care. So it was very important that we set it up this way, even if in the end we take that out and we throw another title in there. The working title was a question. So think about that when you're writing. Use questions, answer them, because that was the force that was getting you to communicate. The other thing is that if you think about an outline, outlines are lots of different questions. So again, when you think about your outline, write your outline in a way of perhaps phrase them all as questions originally, like why, to whom is Gradle relevant? And later we come through and we write broad platform support. Okay, so because that, we may need in the end for people to be able to read it, not the way that we were answering the question, but as statements. So we turn those questions into statements, but start out with questions. What is important about Gradle's dependency management? And then we later came back and said, Gradle's dependency management is robust, so we'll just make it a statement. So in general, writing that way is a bit more complicated because, you have to think, well, should this come before this? Should this go after this? But we're adding a lot more complexity than really what just is the fact that we're moving from conversational to structured content. And that's really kind of what brings us here today, is that we don't feel like, even if we've done it a couple of times, that we're really feeling good about it, that we're really feeling relaxed and confident. But I want you to feel that way. And the reason is we're fabricating a lot of barriers. We fabricate barriers in our tool chain. We fabricate barriers in the way in which we collaborate, and we fabricate barriers in, thinking about writing without the tools that we're used to. Okay, so it's not just that we introduce complex tools, but it's also that we're stepping outside of our comfort zone. So it goes back to that idea of, if we were, the difference between, say, for instance, talking with someone and doing a presentation, right? We get up on stage doing the presentation feels a bit more nerve-wracking because how often are we standing on stage doing a presentation unless you're, a tour speaker? It's very, very infrequently. So we have to remember that being out of our comfort zone is not really going to put us in a zen feeling. It's going to bring anxiety. So we want to fix that. So let's fix it. So how do we fix it? Well, we fix it the way that we deal with anything complicated in life. We look for the IKEA diagram. So let's assume for a second that we're building something like a house. House is a complicated thing to build. What is it that IKEA thinks that we need to know about? Well, the first thing that we start out with is that we have a picture of what it is that we want in our minds. Okay? And then we think about the tools that we're going to need to get there. So we need tools. But the other thing that's very important is we need to know what is generally right and what is generally wrong so that we know if we're going down the path that we have building this thing upside down. And, we've done that with I'm sure with a piece of IKEA furniture. You built it and you're like, it's cool, it's all together, but except it's upside down. Now we have to take it all apart. So we need to go, what's heads or tails? And then, of course, the most important thing, where do all those little dowel rods go? And then finally, magic happens, and then we have this beautiful house. But the important thing here is to think about is that in order to do something complicated, we don't think about starting at the very end and saying, okay, where do all the lines go looking at the final diagram? We lay out the tools, we count them, we make sure we have them. We get a general idea of whether we're going down the right or wrong path, and then we start with step one. We go through the process. So process and tools are extremely important to getting the end result that we need. And we can tackle just about any problem if we think about getting ourselves set up just right. We're intelligent people, we'll be able to do it. So what are some of these barriers that we're putting up, and why is it that we're not following this process? Well, imagine if we wrote code the way that we write docs. I'm sure you may, if you look at some of the symbols, you may recognize what this would, essentially be here if it was Java code on the right-hand side. It's a very simple example. But this is really what a lot of our docs look like today. We're writing in HTML, or we're writing in XML, or DocBook, or something like that. Or perhaps we're writing in where we can't even see the source, and the source is all binary and behind the scenes, and it looks uglier than this. But the point is that we write code in a certain way, but when we write docs, we don't do it that way. So we're out of our comfort zone. If we're not doing it this way, we might do it this way. Now we really start to feel like Jacques here because we're pigeonholed and sort of railroad into this very minimal, narrow window where we have to type, and it doesn't know anything about source code. And I'm, essentially here I'm putting in a source code example. And as soon as I save it and then open it up again, all the end lines are gone, or it decided it was going to reflow it in some other way. It doesn't recognize that it's code. And to find this, how do I know if someone else has changed it? How do I know, how do I know what the history was, the version, all of that stuff. None of that is here. None of that, this isn't what we're used to. We're not used to seeing this. We're used to seeing like a GitHub repository. So what if we could eliminate that type of stuff and we could get back in writing documentation like we write code? So here, if we look at a document, which this is an AsciiDoc document, foreshadowing a little bit here, that it's just content with, okay, a little bit of markup here and there, but for the most part, it's just content. And we can see clearly what it is that we're writing. So when people write an AsciiDoc, one of the things that I always get as feedback, kind of in the first or second thing that they say after I'm talking to them, is that when I was writing an AsciiDoc, I could see what I was writing. It was very clear to me. And if you compare that to, to something like this, here our eyes focused on all of the other things that are surrounding our content, and to see the content, it's a lot of effort. So if we go back to the idea that writing is hard, and we're making it harder to write because we can't see what we're writing, why exactly would we want to do that? So we want to make it so that you can see and not let anything get in your way. And there are techniques, that even in AsciiDoc, sometimes, that the syntax can get in your way, and there's techniques to minimize it, but you should always be trying to minimize it and get it back. Now, here's the beautiful thing about this compared to text messaging. Think about a text message for a second. In what format do you write the text message? Just write in words, right? So here, this is where we're getting back to. It's just like a text message. There's no special editor or anything. You're just writing. It was easy to write the text because what is in your mind are words. You can't hold binary structures in your mind. I mean, maybe some people can, but very few of us. And you're just translating it down to a page. If you can have that for your technical documentation, maybe you have a chance to say, hey, I just thought of how I might do that section, and I'm just typing it. So you open a text file and you just type. It feels like you're writing a text message or a tweet. So what we want to do here, what we're getting at is we want to treat docs like code. Docs are code, as a matter of fact. So what exactly is the difference between a programming language and a human written language? Well, we design our programming languages after our written languages. And that's the whole idea, is that we're trying to get closer and closer to writing. So if code is trying to be more like docs, at what point are docs going to wake up and realize that code is modeling itself after it, and it is in fact the prototype, the archetype of code is writing? So we want to treat it like. So that brings us to AsciiDoc and Asciidoctor. Now, before I continue on, I want to put these both on the same slide and give you definitions so that you don't get this confused, because it can be easy to mix up. AsciiDoc is a syntax for writing. Actually, it's more of an anti-syntax for writing, because it really gets back to what I was saying about plain text. You could argue that when you write a tweet or a plain text, you're using some sort of markup language, because you always mark up the text a little bit, an @ symbol to refer to another person, or stars around something to sort of emphasize it. That's what we're kind of talking about, is that we use some subtle hints, but for the most part, we're just writing. So that's AsciiDoc, the syntax. AsciiDoctor is the thing that parses that syntax, and it converts it to things, or it provides a whole slew of tools. So at the time of doing this talk, there are about 50 projects in the AsciiDoctor ecosystem. It's one of the fastest growing open source projects I've ever seen or been involved in. And not all of the tools are in, polished state, but what's great is there's lots of lines in the water. So there's a lot of experimentation going on, and there's a lot of stuff that you can play with, and we are trying to solve a really hard problem. It's not necessarily something that we can just know what to create for tools. We really have to try this stuff. But we're trying a lot of things to make writing simple. So that's the difference between AsciiDoc and AsciiDoctor, just so you know. But for the most part, when we talk about the writing, we talk about AsciiDoc, and we talk about any of the tools, and we're talking about AsciiDoctor. So what do these things bring to us? I want to kind of go through these one by one, because they're so important. This is the essence of treating docs as code and making a breakthrough and finally being able to find sort of a writing, fluent writing style. So number one is editing. So the idea that we want to get to is that when you write a tweet, you write a text message, you don't need any sort of special tool other than, okay, so when you use the app, you're really just posting it to that social network or through that network in some way. But the form field itself is not a tool. It's just a blank space, and you fill in the blank, and you press send. So what we want is, when you write, is that you open up a blank document that's just a box for a text field, and you just write. And where that is, you can use, as I mentioned, we have a growing number of tools. Just like an IDE with source code. The source code and the IDE are totally separate. The IDE helps you write the source code faster, but then the IDE goes to sleep, it goes away, and the source code lives on. So the tools are there to help us get the stuff on the page, but they're not supposed to be the thing that is storing or maintaining that content. That content should be a first-level citizen, first-class citizen, just like your source code. It's in a Git repository somewhere. The second thing is reading it. So I'm going to show you a couple of tools that allow us to read it, look at this content, and view it in different ways. But for the most part, you don't need a special editor. And it was funny, I was talking to someone recently who didn't really know about AsciiDoc, and we had written some things in AsciiDoc, and they said, what tool do I need to open this? And I said, well, you just need a text editor. You don't need any special tool, Word or anything like that. You just need a text editor. And they said, what's text editor? Well, now we have a different problem, see. So I make fun of that. It sounds like it's sort of a geek joke. But actually, if you think about it, at what point did we think that writing was actually, documents rather, were something that were technical? And that a text editor was technical? If we go before we had the computer, we wrote with a pen on paper. So if I gave you a piece of paper and you said, what do I need to open this piece of paper? Your eyes? Just look at it. A text editor is supposed to be just a piece of paper with pen, that's written on with a pen or a pencil in digital form. That's it. So we kind of lost that at some point. That we thought that was geeky, but no one ever thought that writing on a piece of paper was geeky. So it's just writing on a piece of paper. And actually, you can write AsciiDoc on a piece of paper in your notepad or whatever, and I do oftentimes think about that because it gives me hints about what the structure is, but it doesn't impose a lot of extra markup. So it's easy to write by hand. The most important one, and the reason I put it right in the middle, is version control. Documents must be versioned, more so than code. If you don't know why they should be versioned, then make a version of a tutorial and then have one of your colleagues start working on a different version of that tutorial and then have another colleague working on a third version. And then you come back to the table and everyone says, okay, so I made a bunch of changes. And you go, you didn't make a change to this document, did you? And where did you make those changes? Oh, I made it in my copy. Because merging written text is about 10 times more difficult than merging code. Because there's really very little structure, and it's very difficult to try to merge thoughts that have diverged, right? So when we merge code, we sort of say, well, this chunk of code goes here, this chunk of code goes here. When you start going off in a different direction, you introduce new subjects or examples, and then my things don't have those examples, or you start using, a particular, imagine two people were writing a story and they were trying to merge their stories together. It's very, very difficult to do. And it's also, there's another aspect of it as well, is that, writing has to be fluent from top to bottom. The only way to know whether it's fluent is to read the whole thing. Source code, you kind of have these tools, compilers, whatever else, but most of the compilers for writing is in our head. And so you almost always need to know if someone touched the document, what did they change and how did they change it? Because I need to read the changes because I know the document in my head. I know where those changes would go potentially or whether they would break what I was writing. So it's one of those things where once you have multiple versions of a written document, then you immediately know why it is that you have to be that you need versioning. And versioning is really one of the keys to sharing because we know that GitHub has made sharing of source code very simple. And if it's versioned and in GitHub, then you're also sharing it. So if someone's like, hey, can I get a copy of that document? You don't have to go into the Google Docs and be like, how do I add a collaborator on this freaking thing? It's on GitHub, go get it. Or even if it's in a private Git repository, you can send them the link and just, they just need access to that in general. So it's a lot simpler and people know that's a single source of truth. They know where it should be when it's done. That's the canonical version. It isn't, well, did you make a clone of it in your Google Docs and now you have a different version? So versioning and sharing are very tightly coordinated there. And then finally, probably the most important thing that the AsciiDoc toolchain provides is conversion. So obviously the end users aren't going to read the raw AsciiDoc source for a number of reasons. Number one, it's not formatted for easy reading and it's not typeset. But there's another aspect as well, is that just like with source code, the source code version isn't necessarily the whole picture. You might have macros, you might have combinators, you might have transforms that occur that actually change the code before it finally gets to production. We see that exact same thing, especially if you treat your docs as code. We use the same patterns. We try to keep the documentation dry so as to not repeat ourselves. We try to validate the documentation or perhaps even have hints that get expanded, so we could have documents get merged, we could have hints that get expanded, etc. So we use the same techniques that we're using when we write code. So I want to give you a quick tour of the AsciiDoc syntax, and I kind of want to go through, don't want to spend too much time on this because you can go to the site and check it out. But I just want to give you a flavor of what it is that I mean when I'm talking about this anti-syntax for writing documentation. So the most important thing is this. It goes back to that idea of writing a tweet or a text. Most of what you're writing, like let's say 80% of it, is just paragraphs, right? Especially when you're writing long form, it's mostly just paragraphs. And a paragraph, okay, is just something that's separated the way we did it when we wrote on paper. You just separate it with a blank line. I know you could do indentation too, but like you would typically, one of the ways of doing it would just put a separate line. And that would make it clear that this is part of this paragraph and this is part of this paragraph. Other than that, you just write. Headings are probably something that you may have done, hundreds of times before, like in a notebook. You may have put like a little asterisk or a star or, some sort of, a symbol prior to that line so that you knew that line was somehow a delimiter. You could also put lines underneath it. It's harder to maintain lines underneath it in a text document because you have to worry about line length. So I prefer the one where you just put equal signs in front. The number of equal signs is the depth of the heading, just like kind of you would imagine like a bulleted list. So the document title just has one equal sign, the first level heading has two, and then when you convert to HTML, that is the H number. So the one equal sign is H1, two equal sign is H2, so it's very easy to remember what it is that you're creating here. Lists are, again, the same way we would do if we were creating a grocery list or a task list on a piece of paper. We use a star or a hyphen or something like that. So the stars give us an unordered list, the dots will give us an ordered list. And notice that with the ordered list, we don't have to put the numbers because, well, it's obvious that 99% of the time you want the numbers to start at 1 and to be sequential. So why write numbers? That's ridiculous. Bold italic code and sort of a custom, have your own CSS class or your own formatting. Bold is stars, italic is underlines, code is backticks, and then these hash signs actually do, by default, they do like a highlighted block of text, but if you want to highlight it in some other way, you can give it your own role. And this is very, very powerful here because something I'll talk about a bit later, there's actually a correlation between AsciiDoc and HTML if you think about the reason that CSS existed. You want metadata in the document to style it, but you don't want the styling information in the document. You just want the intent to style it, and then you can style it. So AsciiDoc supports that. So almost anywhere in AsciiDoc, you can add a CSS role so that if you're converting to HTML, you can style it. So you can actually get quite advanced formatting using this approach. And in some of the other backends, like PDF, etc., we honor those as well. We just style it either in a way that you specify or some default behavior. Notice one thing I'll point out here in the inline formatting. If you're familiar with Markdown, which AsciiDoc is very similar to, AsciiDoc tries to be very consistent. So instead of it being 1 star for italic and 2 stars for bold, AsciiDoc actually uses the doubling of symbols for something separate. The doubling of symbols means that you can format anywhere, including in the middle of a word. Single means it's at the boundaries of the word. So therefore, it's a different symbol for each type, and double allows you to format in a less constrained way. So it tries to be very consistent in how it's using its symbol so that italic is always underlined and it's never something else. You can do links. Links are recognized by default. You can actually turn that off. You can give it a specific label, and then something that's very important is, and especially for technical documentation, you can do cross-references in AsciiDoc as well. So in addition to providing a CSS class for almost any structural element in AsciiDoc, you can also provide an ID. By providing an ID, you can link to it. You'll notice here that when I wrote C syntax and I showed it rendered on the right-hand side, it says syntax tour, automatically picks up the title of it and then renders the title instead of the actual ID. So it does some intelligence there, and there's ways for you to tap into and extend that. If you needed to override, for instance, the ID, then of course you can put your own label. And I'm only showing you a small snippet of what some of these cross-reference, like what some of this syntax can do, because there's actually a lot more features in each of the syntax if you have more advanced requirements. AsciiDoc has this idea, most of its block structures, aside from paragraphs, are what are called, in GitHub flavored Markdown, they're called fences. But basically you have, just like an enclosure, you have a starting fence and an ending fence, and everything in between it is of that type. So there are things like listings and source and literal, example blocks, admonition. So, okay, my point here is that there's a lot of different structural elements that you have to choose from that you pull them out of the bag every now and again. You're not using these all the time, except if you're writing technical documentation, you're probably using the source block almost always, which I'll show you an example in the next slide. But the idea here is that there's a lot of known built-in types that you're going to need. Sidebars are a very common thing. Any book, any technical book you open up, history book, whatever else, there's a sidebar, right? So it has that structural element. And these are the types of things that you might have needed when you were using DocBook. So we've kind of pulled those things over into AsciiDoc so that you can have them. If you have something that is not supported by default, that's what this first block is for. It's called an open block. And I'll talk about extensions a bit later, but it lets you can write your own interpretation of that. So you just basically put these dashed lines around your content, and then that can become something special. Like, for instance, as an example, it can become a diagram. So it can be a text-based diagram that gets rendered into an image. Source code, which you saw in the example AsciiDoc that I showed earlier, source code uses this idea of fences. So you put 4 hyphens at the top of the source code, 4 hyphens at the bottom, and you're immediately a source code. If you want to highlight it, get syntax highlighting, then you have to add some attributes at the top, source, comma, and then the language. There is a way to provide a default language for the whole document if you're never changing languages. And then at the very top, you notice that we have this directive. We basically say, I would like to source highlight this document, and that is the engine for source highlighting I want to use. You can actually pass that in to the parser too. You don't have to put it into the document, but it just shows an example. And then a nice little bonus feature here that you don't see in almost any other markup language is that you have the ability to do those little call-out bubbles. So if you need to make commentary on a particular line of the source code, you can just put, a number, and then at the bottom you can put this, and this becomes a bulleted list, and that becomes one of those number bullets that's in the line. You can do things like admonition, so you can break up the text, and it has a little icon. I wanted to show an example. When I pull up the editor, I'll show you an example of it. But it'll put a little icon before it, and maybe the text will be green, or the text will be red or something, so you can draw attention to a point. And it's important to point this out because, like in some of the other languages, Markdown in particular, people, they don't have a way to express this, so they use a block quote instead. And the thing is that technically, semantically, that's not correct, because it's not a quote, it's actually a statement. So we're very minimal, with very minimal syntax, we're able to capture that information. You can do things like images, videos, icons. And if you'll notice something, when you look at these, you'll notice that they kind of follow a similar pattern. So remember I was saying that AsciiDoc is very rooted in this idea of programming and code and trying to take inspiration from source code. So like source code, we want to use the constructs over and over again. We want to have patterns. And so they look very much like functions. So the name of the function is what comes before the colons, and then there's some sort of primary argument, which is the target, and then there's like an attribute list of additional arguments that may be relevant only for that particular type. And so if it's very difficult to forget the syntax because there's really only one way of writing anything, and then you just change the words, and the words are easy to remember because you know what you're trying to make, an image or a video, right? So the only thing you have to remember is what am I making, and that one pattern. In the first two, you'll notice that there's 2 colons, and the last one there's only 1. That's because these are 2 different areas of the code where they apply. The first one is an inline macro. So if you were writing along and you want to put an icon in the middle, like press the play button and you want to put like a little play icon, or you want to put a button or something like that, you do an inline macro. A block macro would be something that it would be a figure. It would stand by itself in the document. It would get its own line, and it would probably take up the whole width of the page, or at least it would box out anything else. So that's the main difference there. But I point that out because that's the only subtle difference between this pattern. Then otherwise, these things are what most of the syntax is, other than the headings and the inline formatting that I showed. So really, what I want you to take away from going through that syntax tour is that we're limiting the amount of markup that you have to type as much as possible. And there are ways to even reduce that further, but we're not limiting the amount of markup that you can type. You can get the structural elements that you need, and you'll notice that earlier, perhaps younger documents, they'll be a little bit more primitive, and then maybe documents that have been around for a long time, they're going to start to get more of these structures, right? Because you have more time with it, it may be meeting specific requirements, but those things come later, just like in you're going through the IKEA diagram. It's not the first thing that you have to worry about. And a lot of these languages, why there's such barriers, is that on day one, you have to worry about complex metadata and structures, and really all you want to start with is I just want to start banging out some paragraphs. When it's not sufficient, and this is very important for a lightweight markup language to be successful, because we are fundamentally cutting a lot of structures out. If you compare AsciiDoc to DocBook, I've had these conversations a number of times. One of the questions is, can AsciiDoc express all of the structures that I need for technical content that DocBook can express? And the answer to that question is not out of the box, because we intentionally cut out lots and lots of ridiculous tags. I mean, DocBook has like 1,000 XML tags, and AsciiDoc only has 24 basic structures. But what it does have is it has the ability to extend that syntax anywhere. And it has it in 3 ways. Number one is custom syntax. So if you wanted to say, create your own inline macro for referring to issues in your issue tracker, make up your own. Follow the pattern. Give it a name. It has a primary target, and it may have additional attributes. The second thing is custom converters. The AsciiDoc document, as I mentioned, is not what the end users see. So just like with code, lots of things can happen between that document and the final version. And I'll give you an example of this later on, but where the Spring.io team does a very good job of playing on this idea that source document isn't necessarily exactly the same as the end document, but there is a logical way that you get from the source document to the rendered document. And then the final thing that you can do is you can do just transforms. So it parses up the document and it becomes a tree. If I gave you an API to a structure, whether it be a data structure coming out of the database, XML structure, etc., as programmers, you think, yeah, I can make it whatever I want. I mean, I can move things around, I can add new stuff, exactly. So really, the sky's the limit when it comes to that. And the idea that you want to do is capture so the human writes the part that the human needs to write about. And then the human can sort of say, and then you can say, I see where you're going with this, I see what you're trying to do, I'm going to write some code, and I'm going to take it the last mile. So let's talk about some tools, because, if we establish that writing documentation is like writing code, well, we write code with tools, so it stands to reason we should still have some tools. But we're going to change the whole idea behind tools. We're going to think about them in a new way. So first of all, the most important tool for AsciiDoc, hands down, is GitHub. So AsciiDoc can be stored in GitHub, because it's just plain text. It can be rendered on GitHub. It can be shared on GitHub. It can be versioned on GitHub, etc., etc. So we get all of those things that we had at the very beginning about the edit, the read. You can also edit the file on GitHub. So you can edit, you can read, you can version, you can share, and the final one, convert. When you look at the document in GitHub, you actually get a preview of it. So here's a great example. So in all of the AsciiDoc, in all the AsciiDoctor projects, we have READMEs, like in most projects on GitHub. We store all of our READMEs in AsciiDoc. If you navigate to the README file on GitHub, what you see is like a nice looking document. It's not perfect, but it's a pretty good looking document. And notice it has a couple of elements. You know, images work. We can refer to images. We can refer to like the status of builds in some image. Links work. If you notice at the bottom of the screen, there's an admonition block. It doesn't look super pretty because GitHub really doesn't have any styling on it. But at least we see that there is a admonition. There's a warning. There's a call out here in the document. So we get an idea of how this document is going to render, even if that's not where we're going to be publishing our production documents. And for visitors, it's quite nice to be able to have a publishing system that you had to do absolutely no work on. Okay? You just put your document into GitHub and you automatically have published it. So this is a great way to share early drafts of documents. You'd be like, hey, yeah, I just pushed a document up on GitHub. Go ahead and read it. Well, first you're going to want to read it. You're going to want to read it like, you know, any other reader. Typeset reasonably. But then you can click up on the right-hand corner. You can see there's the raw button. And you can get the raw source. And you can see the history. Now, let's say you don't necessarily like reading the documents on GitHub. Do you have to then download it and convert it and do it? No. So there's a tool called DocGist. And what DocGist is basically it's a viewer on top of GitHub. So you copy that URL and you go to gist.asciidoctor.org and see in the upper right-hand corner there's a text box that says GitHub, a gist, a file, or a Dropbox URL. You just paste the URL in there and voila, it renders it using our style sheet instead of GitHub style sheet. It's the exact same document and it didn't get copied anywhere. It literally is just done inside the browser. It just gives you a better view. So this is sort of like it's like Chrome over top of GitHub for AsciiDoc documents. And it's this is quite helpful when you're just sharing early drafts of documents and you can just shoot this, then you copy this URL, put it in an email, and they don't have to know to go to GitHub, copy the URL, go to AsciiDoctor, gist, and paste it in. They just see a web page. So being able to share content by web pages is an extremely important technique to helping with the writing collaboration. There's no, oh, I didn't add you to the share on, you know, Google Docs, or you have to go to Google Docs and it's like, which of the 8 Google accounts do you want to log into to see this document? And you're like, I have no idea what I'm supposed to click on. So this is extremely nice. If you want to know, hey, who changed this document last and what did they do? GitHub also has really nice viewing tools at the source level to view changes to content, just like we see changes to code. So here we can see, notice that, okay, obviously this paragraph changed, but not only did the paragraph change, it highlights what specific word was not in this side that's in that side. So it's good diff tools. I mean, these are really, really good diff tools. And again, for no work. I mean, you've downloaded nothing. You just get this out of the box. Now, if this were an XML document, which I don't have an example of, but if this were an XML document, there could have been a lot of other changes with white space and indentation and other types of markup that was not the content that you don't care about. It's making it very hard to read. But here, because AsciiDoc syntax is mostly staying out of the way, the changes are content. So you're getting right to it. There's an even better way to look at it, and it doesn't always work, but it works in most cases. Is that it actually has this, what they call Prose diff. So it actually renders both documents, and then it shows you how they differ if you were reading them and overlays it. So this is there's no diff tool available that I know of for free that can do this other than GitHub this well. So use this tool. I mean, this is just awesome. This is great, especially when you're when someone made changes to your document and you need to just really quickly get a high-level view of whether stuff changed and what they changed. You can really dial in on it. And notice that it's not just the diffing. Notice they collapse the portions of the document that you don't need to see. So it's really only, I mean, you can expand them, of course, but you're only looking at the changes. I mean, you're talking about turning edits around like super quickly. And one thing that I want to mention too is that you know, if you go to that document or any document, this works for, it's not just READMEs, by the way, it's any AsciiDoc document. And you click the little edit pencil, if you have access to the repository, you can just change it right there. If you don't, it'll fork it. But it actually allows you to go in and change the document directly on GitHub, and that preview changes thing, the Prose diff shows here too. So while you're editing the document, you get to see your own Prose diff, which is pretty amazing. And then when you're done, you can just go down and type a commit, and you can, now this is really nice, they have this where you can create basically a new branch that sends a pull request instead of just changing the document directly. But I'm able to, it's not necessarily the real-time editing yet, that Google Docs offers, but this is pretty advanced workflow for being able to edit and documents in a very lightweight way. So again, look at all the tools that you're getting just by putting it on GitHub, and you're not even really having to, require tools for your team. So one of the things that's important, so we have all those tools, and that's nice, but what you want to do is you want to bring that document down, and when you're the editor and you're really getting into it, you're going to want to do this locally. And one of the things that you're going to want when you're editing locally is you're going to want to just be able to preview it like you did on GitHub. Now, you could download AsciiDoc and you could, convert the document to HTML and then open in your browser. But that, when you're just navigating around your file system, that can actually slow you down a bit. So we thought about, well, how can we speed that process up? So that brings us to the AsciiDoc.js live preview. So this is an extension for Chrome. And there's also an equivalent one for Firefox. And what it allows you to do is navigate to any AsciiDoc file that's on your local file system, and you get the rendered version just like you were seeing on GitHub. Actually, you see the version that's more similar to what was in DocGist, but you see a very nice rendered version of your document. So when I'm in my workflow all day long, so I have an example here. So I have an AsciiDoc document here. I'm studying several languages, so these are the language instructions for French. And I was writing it up as AsciiDoc so I can remember the rules. And I just navigate to the file on my file system, and I can see it in AsciiDoc form. But if I want to be able to read it, so that's when I'm kind of editing it, but if I want to read it, I want to see it in rendered form. So there we go. The browser just immediately converts it right on the fly and shows you a rendered version of your document. And so you can see and support, all the features of AsciiDoc. It supports tables, etc. And this is an amazing way to, as you're writing, give me a preview. What does this document look like? Give me a preview. You can actually easily get PDF out of this too, because most browsers can print a PDF. So if I just did print and then save as file and save as PDF, then I can just email this to someone. I've got a PDF. So just like with the browser already, I'm giving myself really advanced tools. And the really important thing to note here is that what we're trying to do is we're trying to make it so that writing isn't really, nothing's distracting you from the brain power that you need to write. We're giving you the tools that you need to be able to use it without any fancy publishing toolchain stuff, because again, what's the difference between this and writing on a piece of paper with pen? We shouldn't need advanced tools to do something we've done for tens of thousands of years. So okay, so that's that one. Absolutely essential tool. It's probably my favorite tool, and I use it all day long. What's great about it is that it supports all the features of AsciiDoc, including math and diagrams and all the advanced features that you can imagine. So that's nice, but what about an IDE? So there's a whole bunch of projects that are in the works right now to provide what is live editing for AsciiDoc documents. And the best way to really show you is actually fire this thing up. So I'll go back to that same document that I just had open, and let's say I'm working on it. So here I'm using the Atom editor. And so, first of all, I get, it's somewhat primitive, but it works fairly well. Syntax highlighting for the AsciiDoc. It just helps adding some contrast, just like you would have if you were syntax highlighting your source code. Let's see, let's toggle the tree view. Yeah. So then what I can do is I can open up so you go into the packages and you look for AsciiDoc and you install the AsciiDoc preview. It's an add-on. And so then what I get is I get that same rendered document now, but I get it right inside my editor. And if I'm changing this, then it's going to follow while I'm changing it. So you can see. And if I wanted to add some source code, then I can just say like public class hello world, and then I'm going to get it right in line. And it automatically, the color's not right on my computer. We have a dark theme problem, but it shows the syntax highlighting automatically. So this is a really great way to kind of give you like that feedback that you're making progress. You know, as you're working, you're seeing it on the right-hand side. You get that visual validation that you're writing the right thing. And you know, it can be very nice, and then you can kind of push it to the side. If you don't want it, you can change it so that it only does it when you save the document. And then you can do things like, you know, I can put, for instance, talk macro, and then I can get a table of contents. Oops. For the document right in line. Let's see. Why did that work? It's making a liar out of me. Oh, there we go. I see what the issue is. Anyway, so then you can get actually a table of contents for your document, and it actually works. So it's pretty crazy, some of the stuff that you can get going in there. So that's the Atom, and there are a couple of these. There's the same thing for the brackets text editor, same thing for IntelliJ, and I think the one for Eclipse is in the works. I don't know what the status exactly is of that. And then there's one for like Sublime. So there's almost any of the major editing tools are getting one of these if one's not already in progress. And so this, Scott, in his blog post that he wrote about AsciiDoctor, he gave a couple of examples of his book. So that's showing, this is showing Pro Git using the Atom editor. So the other thing that's important is build automation tools. So obviously you're not going to want to do these manual conversions every single time. You're going to want to have this as part of, especially if it's part of your technical documentation for your project or for your product. So there are plugins for all the major build tools. There's plugins for Gradle and Maven and Grunt and Gulp and Ant. And so I'm showing here just the example of the build Gradle file. You know, you grab the plugin in its normal way of grabbing a plugin in Gradle, and then you can call AsciiDoctor and you can pass in things like if you want to enable the table of contents, if you want to enable font-based icons, etc. You can do that. The other really cool thing about the Gradle plugin is that it allows you to write extensions directly in the Gradle plugin itself, which is good for prototyping. And I mean, obviously, over time, you would want to actually move these out into a library. But you can say, in this particular case, I gave the example before of doing an inline macro for an issue reference. So you can just do that right in line, and using the APIs that AsciiDoctor gives you, you're allowed to introduce new syntax into your document. So how I imagine syntax is that teams or companies, they would build up an extra vocabulary, if you will, of syntax. Obviously, things like that aren't going to, you render it on GitHub, it's not going to work because GitHub doesn't have that extension, but you know, the information in the macro will just render in raw form, which is still very, you know, I mean, when you're previewing it, you know what that means. So because it's plain text, it doesn't necessarily hide itself. One thing I want to show you, because I had mentioned I was going to show it to you. So AsciiDoc has quite a number of interesting features. Again, that I think one of the feedback I've gotten about AsciiDoctor's documents is that, you know, they're very pretty by default, and that was very intentional. We tried to make it so that without a lot of effort, you get rewarded for the writing that you did. So just as an example, we have this, this integration with Font Awesome, which is an icon-based library. And icons are a very powerful thing because, you know, they can sometimes relax the reader's eyes a little bit, give them extra context, etc. So if I were to say tip, check out AsciiDoc, you can see we get the little icon there. That works for all the admonition blocks. So if I said important, don't forget about that, we get another little icon box there. I mean, another little icon. If I just want to make my own icon, I can just use the icon tag, and then I can see, get a little heart. If I want to make it a little bigger, I can make it bigger. If I want to make it red, I can just say role equals red. That goes into that thing I was saying before about everything's based on CSS classes. So role equals is CSS class. I have, inside the AsciiDoctor style sheet, we have all the major colors. So you can just say role equals whatever, and it'll just make it that color. So this is a nice way to quickly spruce up your document. It's, you know, it's for as much as we use emoji and text messages. We actually have an extension which is not yet enabled in Atom, but we have the emoji extension too. So any emoji you can type, and then it'll actually put the emoji in there, and then it'll render it using the one of the emoji font libraries. So they're kind of similar, the two, but hey, we have coverage for it all. So I think that, you know, one of the reasons, so it's interesting, so I'll just pause for a second to make a comment about this. So the icons are an interesting thing. So icons cheapen the document to some degree, right? When you add like little embellishments like that, to a large degree, in the final versions of your professional docs, you probably want to get rid of most of that stuff. But what's funny is that icons have a very important role psychologically for humans. It seems to motivate people to write. So it goes back to that idea of writing the outline as questions and then just answering the questions and then changing them back to statements when you're done. If adding an icon makes you motivated to write that particular section, then write the section and then remove the icon when you're done. I mean, if we have to figure out how to hack our brains to write, and I found that there's really something to that. So maybe someone's done some research about why that matters, but for some reason, when we see things that we like little eye candy, it makes us happy, and when we're happy, then we write. So why question the thing that works? So speaking of that, I want to talk about finish off by talking about some writing techniques. So the reason I got into AsciiDoctor is because I wrote a book in Word, and I vowed that I would never write again if I ever had to write that way. I was going to come up with a better way of writing. So I really set out on a mission to find something, and it took me many years to sort of find my way to where I am today. But in the process, it would be wrong to say that all of this has to do with AsciiDoc, the syntax, because there's actually a lot of techniques that I figured out in the process that I can do because I'm writing in AsciiDoc, but are not an AsciiDoc thing. And these things actually are the way that I've gotten myself to be able to sit down, write a full tutorial in 3 or 4 hours, and then be ready to publish a draft without having writer's block. So this is what I believe allows me to achieve writing Zen. So number one is sentence per line. This is probably the most powerful writing technique I've ever come across in my entire life. The idea is that every single sentence or major, significant clause, if it was a semicolon or something like that, or a bulleted list, every single one gets its own line. Now think about for a second how you write source code. When you write source code, every statement gets its own line for the most part. Very rarely do you write a whole bunch of statements all in one line. Obviously there's always exceptions, but for the most part, statement per line. So first of all, if you're a programmer, this is going to tap into that part of your brain. So because you think about every statement per line, you will just activate something that makes it feel like you're writing code. But then you benefit from a lot of the things that you benefit in code. Number one is, if a change occurs, it's localized to that line. So when you see the diff, for instance, it doesn't cause any sort of wrapping to occur. And this, by the way, when you do sentence per line, you do not arbitrarily wrap your document. Literally, you just let a sentence sprawl. The first question I always get is, but what about long sentences? Won't they run over? Yes, they will. Shorten the sentence. Every sentence shouldn't really be more than 80 characters. For every sentence you're writing that's over 80 characters, the people that are reading your document have to read the sentence over 80 characters. And no one likes to read those sentences. Okay, so shorten the sentence. So I asked the guys who introduced this to me, was the Neo4j guys, I asked them the same question. I said, what about long sentences? They said, it's simple. None of our sentences are allowed to be longer than 80 lines. 80 columns. So, problem solved. No need to wrap. Just shorten your sentences. You will actually write so much more, your writing will be so much more powerful if you write short sentences than if you write long sentences. Because short sentences are direct and they're very clear. The reason your sentence is long is because it's meandering and it doesn't have a point. So when we wrote recently when I mentioned we've been working on the Gradle documentation, when we wrote it, the biggest problem the Gradle documentation has is this long-winded sentences no one wants to read. So we turned it around and said, here are very clear statements. And adverbs and adjectives got thrown out a lot. There was a lot of that going on. But okay, so occasionally a sentence is a little bit longer, but it's okay. The other thing is, when you're writing and you're trying to get a paragraph just right, one of the things that you need to do is you need to move the sentences around. Because it's like, well, I don't know if I want to say that first. I want to say this point first. So one technique that was originally given to me was write all your paragraphs as bulleted lists. The problem is then you have to go through and you have to remove all the bulleted lists when you're done. It's kind of weird. So essentially what we're doing is we're doing the same thing. We're writing bulleted lists by assuming each list item. And probably if you were watching over my shoulder, watching me edit, once I get the stuff written down, I change probably every single line in the entire document. I probably change the order at least once, if not multiple times. I'm always moving the sentences around, trying to figure out whether it was right to introduce that topic first or make that point first or this point first. If you were wrapping arbitrarily, you have to very carefully and surgically remove that sentence and go put it to another place. And then there was a cost associated with that, so you're less likely to move your sentences around, and then less likely to get good writing. And then finally, the reason that this is extremely valuable is that you can change sentences from one paragraph to another, so they can hop between paragraphs. So not just the order of them, but you can just grab a whole thought and then go and throw it somewhere else in the document. Or, and I'll mention in 2 slides, I'll mention about comments. You can actually remove the sentence temporarily. Actually, let's do that one first. So comment it out. Most markup languages don't have this. Imagine if you were writing code and you had no comments. How would you write code? It'd be impossible. So I'm sitting here writing in the Atom editor. Notice I have sentence per line all the way down. So I'm just like, I don't want that sentence for right now. And I don't have Vim up, so normally I have my key bindings. I want to move that one to the end. Or it's like, let's just remove this whole section for right now and not do this right now. So you can just, boom, knock out the section. Now that section's gone for temporarily. And if we had the live preview up, you'd see, obviously, there it goes. The other thing that this is useful for is talking to each other. So it's like, you can just DA, I don't like this first sentence. Yes? And then someone could write back, in the document, S. White, that's my wife. Too bad, we're keeping it. Actually, it would probably be the other way around. I would be the one trying to keep the sentence, and she would be the one be going, get rid of it. So yeah, so that's an extremely powerful feature. I couldn't write now. Today, there's no way I could write without being able to use comments. I'm talking to myself all the time when I'm writing. I have thoughts, I'm like, yeah, I want this to be better later, or let's try this sentence, I hate that sentence. Oh, but I don't want to delete it because I might use it later. I'm still in love with it. Oh, but it lets me let the sentence go without deleting it. Yeah, let's just cut that sentence for now. And then you read it later and you go, you know what, it's fine without it. Let's just go ahead and throw it away. So these are crucial techniques to really achieving fluent writing. Couch reading. I absolutely 100% recommend doing this. Okay, publish your document. Now, we know it's easy. GitHub, you just check it into source code or whatever. Go away from your computer, get out your phone or your smallest device that you have. Not your big tablet, small. You want a very, very narrow window. Sit down on your couch, get some beer, tea, whatever it is that you want, and start reading. I guarantee you there will be no bug that's too small that you will find in your writing. There's something about you're far away from it. You can't edit because you're not at your desktop, and it would be very tedious to try to edit at that point. You are forced to read every word because every word is taking up like half the screen. You will see sentences that are like, that's awkward, or that word definitely is throwing the sentence off, or you'll notice errors. Like, wait a minute, where's the subject in this sentence? Because you just can't, and I've tried really hard to duplicate that at my desktop. I can't. There's something I cannot unlock in my brain about reading that I get when I do couch reading. So sit down when you're done reading and do some couch. If you're stuck and you don't know where to go with it, sit down and do this. Because you'll be reading it and you'll start kind of writing in your mind, yeah, I know where I want to go with this. I know where to go. And you have that feeling you want to write, but you can't write because you're not at your computer yet. So it builds. And by the time you go back to your computer, because it takes a while to get it up and open it up and get back to your editor, you're motivated to write. So I've hacked my brain on a number of occasions by using this idea of couch reading. This is kind of a small one, curl your quotes. The more that we get used to writing emoji in text messages, the more we realize that we don't really need syntax for some of this stuff, like curly quotes. So there's a specific syntax in AsciiDoc for curly quotes. If you can learn how to type some of this stuff in en dash and em dash, curly quotes, etc., it drastically reduces the syntax that you have in your document because you're just typing the thing that you want instead of typing a syntax that gives you the thing that you want. And, maybe it's not good for super broad teams where people are going to get messed up by that, but especially for for tight-knit teams, yeah, just learn how to type them, and it's actually not that difficult on Mac, Windows, and Linux to learn how to type them. It's just a couple of extra commands that you have to do, and arguably in the future we'll have keyboards that'll have these in there. And then finally, 2 coding techniques that are extremely important, and it'll lead me to my last example of Spring.io. Dry attributes. So you don't want to repeat yourself. AsciiDoc has the ability to essentially have variables. You can store content in variables. The content can only be line-oriented content at the moment, but this is great for things like URLs that you're typing 100 times. Just make an attribute out of it, and then wherever you have to use it, you just say find more about, and then you do the attribute URI project, and then its name. You can even make the whole link an attribute as well, and I do this by using prefixes. So URI, when it's just a raw URI, if it's an actual link and includes the label, then I do link hyphen, and then you come up with different prefixes. It's good that you put the namespace at the beginning of the attribute instead of the end, so when the attributes get sorted, then they all stay together, all the URIs get together, all the links get together, etc. So I really, really like this technique. And then finally, includes. So probably the biggest feature that AsciiDoc has that's both empowering and sets it apart from other ones is the include macro. So the include macro allows you to merge documents together or weave content, reusable content from one document into another. And it also allows you to include fragments of source code that are tagged with special comments. So you can actually pull code right out of your test suite and put it into your documentation, and then the code that's in your documentation was not copy-pasted there, which is probably the biggest crime of technical documentation, is copy-paste code that gets out of date and it doesn't syntax check. So absolutely use this. So getting to the example. So the Spring.io guides are mostly written in AsciiDoc, and they use both of these techniques very well. So the first thing they have is, if I can get into it, fine, edit anyway, okay. If you bring up, for instance, the Gradle guide, so this is rendered AsciiDoc content, you'll see that it has a title, and then it has this how to complete this guide, and then some information about it, and then it gets into the first section. They needed this section, as one example, in almost every single one of the guides. So instead of copying and pasting, and then when someone edited this document, now it's not the same in all of them, they used the include for this. So what they did was it's interesting how informal it is, but how important it is that it's this informal. If you'll notice that the include document is just a link to the actual raw file off of GitHub. So one could argue, well, that maybe, you want to use an attribute for that, or maybe, maybe you shouldn't, someone was concerned they're linking directly out to the master branch or something like that. But imagine, look at what it enabled. It's so simple now to just link anywhere in GitHub and grab some content and stick it into your document. So shared content doesn't have to be, even part of your project. That's the point. So how to complete this guide is now a generic document that gets merged in. But there are references in that section to things that have to do with this particular guide. So the include document actually can see the variables from the document into which it's included. So if you notice at the top of the document, there's a variable for project ID. Well, project ID is then used by that content that comes in from the include and layered in and sprinkled in all the little places that were dynamic. So now that how to complete this guide is specific to that particular guide. So we've used not only includes, but we've used the variables and the includes together to make a more powerful include. And then the other thing that this document does is that it includes the source code from the sample project that is the project that you checked out, its own project. And that's an example of just including the entire file. And then a little bit further down, let's jump to it. Yeah, here's an example of just including a segment of the file. So if you were reviewing the file and you went to the very end of this, you actually see the full file and you can see where that tag repositories is. So what AsciiDoc can do is it can go in here and it can extract just this section. And then somewhere higher up in this document is just a code sample of just that section. But notice that same file got used several times in the same guide in different ways. Sometimes as the full file, sometimes as part of the file, etc. And it could be combined with other source, etc. So it's actually really nice to be able to use this include feature and keep your content from being copy-pasted all over the place, which is just a nightmare to maintain. So authors absolutely agree. I've never really heard anything different so far, that they really love this experience, and that's why we're doing what we're doing, and that's what I want you to be able to achieve. So Greg Turnquist, who's the author of Learning Spring Boot, posted this tweet the other day. I find going back to Markdown akin to trading in utensils and eating with my hands. Scott Chacon says, I can do truly amazing things now with my AsciiDoc source book. And that really is such an important message to sort of end on, because when you put it in AsciiDoc, what you can do with it is really then up to you. You really have a lot of flexibility. And it does have serious and interesting implications for publishing industry as a whole. So I want to thank you very much for attending the talk. I really hope that you do find your writing zen, and I want to give illustration cred to my wife, Sarah White, who did all the illustrations at the beginning of the presentation. Thank you very much.